All right, y'all, I'm gonna show you how to do a Sugartong splint. This is Roger. He's gonna be my stunt double for the splint here. So materials for a Sugartong, you'll need about 3 rolls of 4-inch plaster. I do about 5 or 6 rolls of 4-inch web roll, and then 1 or 2 ace bandages, with one of them with a thumb hole cut in it. So I'll show you how to do that in a second. So before you start, make sure you have all your materials ready like we talked about earlier. And then when you're measuring out your plaster, you got to make sure that you come all the way up to the metacarpal heads there, and then on the both anterior and the posterior aspect of the hand. So I always measure a little bit long because you could always tear your plaster afterwards and shorten it. But when you dip and the water gets, or the plaster gets hot, it's going to shrink. So you want to be longer than shorter if you're going to err on one side or the other. So we've already got everything measured out. So I'm going to go ahead and start wrapping up Roger. First thing I do is I start the wrist here. The key is you want to make sure you pad the bony prominences. So I pad the wrist with three or four rolls, and then I start traveling up to the hand, make a little tear there for the thumb, and then I wrap the metacarpal heads 3 or 4 times, tearing each time. That's 3. There's 4. Come back down, make a little tear at the top to cover the thumb, and then come back down through the rest of the forearm. And when you're traversing the arm, you want to cover about a third of, you want to translate about a third of the distance of your web roll or your soft roll, so you have adequate coverage. Because as we talked about before, if you have too little coverage, you could burn the patient as the plaster dries. Also with web roll or soft roll, you can't tie it too tight, because if you pull it too hard, it's just going to rip. So you can be pretty aggressive with how tightly you wrap with the web roll. Just you want to be careful when you're wrapping your ace wrap. So when I get to the top of the arm here, I usually wrap about 4 or 5 times, just because that's where the end of your plaster is going to be, and you can get pressure points there. It can cause skin necrosis. And then what I do is, if you don't mind holding your arm up, usually you have an assistant holding you. What I like to do is I pad the elbow, because the elbow is another bony prominence that's going to cause some pressure points that could cause skin necrosis in your splint. So what I do is, we call it punching. I'll punch it 3 times, both kind of at the one here at top, one here in the middle, and then one here in the bottom. 3 times, and then do that 3 times. So you can have a nice pad at the elbow. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. And then on my last one, instead of ripping it, I'll just kind of collect all my soft roll here, and then kind of cover any thin areas that I have. So I'll come back down to the forearm. If you can see through your plaster, if you can see skin, you're too thin. So that's another a way to gauge if you're they call it shadowing. If you're shadowing through your web roll, then you need to cover it with some more. So we're wrapped here. Got my, let me pre-check my measurement here. I'm long, which is good. Make sure I have my water. Again, the water should be not too hot so we can burn the patient, but not too cold, because then you're sitting there molding your splint for too long. So dip, give it one good squeeze, and then kind of wring it out. I call this laminating your plaster. Take 2 fingers and just kind of run it the length of the plaster to get all that excess water out. Just like that. Also for Sugartongs, I make a little cut at the end for where the thumb goes, so when it molds, you're blocking your metacarpal heads there, and then your thumb has room to oppose, so it doesn't get obstructed or have any skin pressure there. So flip it around. So again, I'm actually a little light on the hand there. I'm gonna go back and put a little fold here in the hand, something like that. Wrap that on there like that, so a little extra pressure where the end of the splint goes. So again, right at the metacarpal necks there, room for the thumb. Thanks, yeah, wouldn't mind holding that for me. Sometimes you can get a nurse in the ER or somebody to help hold the arm for you, or if you have a nice patient like Roger, he'll do it for you. So it ends kind of right where I want it. Go ahead and wrap it. You don't have to necessarily, go ahead and lift that for me. You don't have to wrap with web roll, but sometimes it's nice because when you take the ace bandage off, after you take the splint off, that dust can go everywhere. So it's nice to kind of cover it with something. Also, I'll try to mold it to the elbow here to get a nice good mold so it don't slide off. Sometimes in larger patients, you don't have as good, you know, I guess molding to the bone. Sometimes the plaster can slide off over time, so make sure you get a decent mold there. So cover with web roll. I'm going to cut a little thumb hole in my ace bandage. Something like that. And then here you're just trying to get your plaster covered, because as soon as you dip it, it starts drying, and then your time window for creating a mold starts to shorten. So once I get it covered, I'll start thinking about my mold now. So if this were a distal radius fracture, I would do a 3-point mold. Use your hand here. Essentially you pull traction, and then this hand just proximal to the fracture, this hand just distal to it, and then your knee as a 3rd point. Essentially you're going to push inward like that to get a volar mold on your distal radius. If it's a both bone, you're going to do an interosseous mold. Essentially find where the fracture site is, and then kind of compress in between the radius and the ulna to get tension on the interosseous membrane, and that should realign your fracture. And you essentially hold that mold for as long as the plaster is drying. We have a little saying that if you think your plaster is dry, hold for another 30 seconds, because the plaster still has some mobility even after you think it's dry. So you want to make sure that your plaster is nice and set before you let go of your reduction. But that's basically it. At the end, I try to make it look a little prettier, so I'd take another ace bandage, which fell, rewrap it, make it look nice for the patient, and then that's it.